A stormy night. A girl finds a shivering puppy abandoned by the roadside, but next to him, a mysterious bag with dark, eerie secrets inside. What's hidden in that bag? Why does everyone want it so badly? And how does this tiny dog hold the key to unraveling a dangerous mystery? Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. The road stretched before her, a narrow ribbon of asphalt swallowed by the pouring rain. Thunder cracked overhead as Lila Prescott tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her eyes squinting through the rhythmic sweep of the wipers. The storm had come without warning, drenching the countryside in a relentless downpour that blurred the edges of the world outside her truck. She hated driving at night, especially in weather like this, but there was no choice. The Wildlife Rehabilitation Center had called her in to assist with an injured deer earlier that afternoon, and it had taken hours to stabilize the animal before releasing it back into the wild. Now, exhaustion tugged at her, and the thought of her small cabin, nestled near the edge of Gallatin National Forest, was the only comfort she had. As she rounded a sharp bend, a flash of movement in the rain jolted her. Lila slammed on the brakes, her truck skidding slightly before coming to a halt. Heart pounding, she scanned the road. There it was, a fallen branch, its jagged edges jutting out like claws. For a moment, she let out a relieved breath. It wasn't an animal, or so she thought. The faintest sound reached her ears, a high-pitched whimper, barely audible over the roar of the storm. Lila frowned, leaning forward to peer through the rain-streaked windshield. Nothing moved. It was probably just the wind playing tricks on her, but the sound came again, softer this time, and it tugged at something deep inside her. With a sigh, she pulled over to the side of the road, flipping on her hazard lights. Grabbing her flashlight from the glove compartment, she braced herself against the cold as she stepped into the storm. Rain pelted her face and shoulders, soaking through her jacket within seconds. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the glistening pavement and the gnarled trees beyond. "Hello," she called, her voice almost swallowed by the storm. "Is someone there?" A movement near the base of a tree caught her eye. She adjusted the flashlight and gasped. There, huddled in the mud, was a small puppy, trembling so violently it looked as though it might fall apart. Its fur was matted, and one of its paws bore a jagged scar that made her wince. "Oh, you poor thing," Lila murmured, her heart aching at the sight. She crouched down, extending her hand cautiously. "It's okay, I'm here. Let's get you out of this rain." The puppy didn't move at first, its wide, terrified eyes locked on hers. Then, slowly, it inched forward, its small body shivering uncontrollably. Lila scooped it up gently, cradling it against her chest. It weighed next to nothing, and she could feel its tiny heart pounding like a trapped bird's. That's when she saw it. Just a few feet away, partially obscured by the underbrush, was a duffel bag. It was old and battered, the fabric fraying at the seams, and dark stains marred its surface. Something about it made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She hesitated, the puppy nestled in her arms, before stepping closer. The bag was partially unzipped, and a faint metallic odor wafted from within, mingling with the earthy scent of rain and mud. Lila's stomach churned. It could be trash, she told herself, something left behind by careless campers. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. Her flashlight beam flickered over the bag, catching on the edges of something inside, something she couldn't quite make out. She swallowed hard, the puppy whining softly against her chest. Whatever was in that bag, she didn't want to find out tonight. Not here, not alone. Lila turned back toward her truck, her boots squelching in the mud. The bag could wait. Right now, getting the puppy to safety was all that mattered. By the time she reached her cabin, the storm had begun to let up, the rain tapering into a steady drizzle. Lila carried the puppy inside, her breath puffing in small clouds in the cold night air. She set it down on a thick towel by the fireplace and lit a fire, the warmth spreading through the small, rustic space. "There," she said softly, kneeling beside the puppy. "You're safe now." The little creature didn't respond, its eyes half closed as it curled into itself. Lila gently examined its scarred paw, her brow furrowing. She couldn't tell if the injury was old or recent, but it would need attention either way. Her thoughts drifted back to the bag. It was still in the bed of her truck, where she had left it. She hadn't been able to bring herself to look inside, and even now, sitting in the comfort of her home, the memory of it sent a chill down her spine. What if someone had been looking for it? What if someone had seen her take it? Lila shook her head, pushing the thoughts away. "One thing at a time," she muttered to herself. First, she needed to make sure the puppy was okay. Then, she would decide what to do about the bag. But as she reached for the first aid kit, a faint scratching noise made her freeze. It was coming from outside, near the truck. Her pulse quickened. The scratching stopped, replaced by a soft rustling, as if something, or someone, was moving around. Lila's grip tightened on the first aid kit. Slowly, she moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The bag was still there, sitting exactly where she had left it. But now, the zipper was fully closed. Lila took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. She had left it partially open. She was sure of it. Her gaze dropped to the puppy, now fast asleep by the fire, its small body rising and falling with each breath. Whatever was happening, she would deal with it in the morning. For now, she locked the doors, checked the windows, and settled into a chair by the fire, the flickering flames casting long shadows on the walls. But sleep didn't come easily that night. Not with the storm howling outside, and the memory of that bag lurking at the edge of her thoughts. The first rays of dawn spilled through the windows of Lila's cabin, chasing away the shadows of the restless night. The fire had long since died down, leaving behind the faint smell of ash and smoke. Lila stirred on the couch, her neck stiff from sleeping in an awkward position. The puppy, whom she had decided to name Rusty, was curled up in a tight ball on the towel near the hearth. For a brief moment, everything seemed peaceful. Then the memories of the previous night came flooding back. The storm, the bag, the strange noises outside. Lila's eyes flicked toward the front door, and her stomach twisted. The bag was still in the truck, and she had no explanation for how its zipper had been closed. She glanced at Rusty, now twitching in his sleep, his little paws paddling as though he were running in a dream. "At least you're not worried," she murmured, running a hand through her hair. But even as she said it, something about Rusty's stillness felt unnatural, as though he were waiting for something. The morning passed in a blur of routine. Lila made herself coffee, checked her emails on the outdated laptop she rarely used, and attempted to focus on anything other than the duffel bag. She busied herself by giving Rusty a proper bath, using warm water and a gentle soap meant for animals. His matted fur softened under her touch, revealing a coppery red hue that glinted like fire in the morning light. "There you go, Rusty," she said, smiling as she wrapped him in a fluffy towel. "Now you look like you belong here." Rusty wagged his tail weakly, but his usual puppy energy was missing. His wide eyes darted toward the window, then to the door, as though he expected someone, or something, to burst in at any moment. Lila frowned, crouching to meet his gaze. "What's wrong, buddy? You're safe now." Her words felt hollow, even as she said them. The unease from last night lingered, curling around her thoughts like a fog. Rusty's scar on his paw caught her eye again. She had cleaned and bandaged it earlier, but something about the jagged mark nagged at her. It wasn't the kind of wound a puppy would get from a simple accident. It looked deliberate. By mid-afternoon, Lila could no longer ignore the bag. Leaving it in the truck felt irresponsible, like inviting trouble she wasn't ready to face. She steeled herself, pulling on a jacket and boots before stepping outside. Rusty, who had been watching her every move, barked sharply and tried to follow her. "Stay here," Lila said firmly, closing the door before he could slip through. His frantic whimpers followed her as she crossed the muddy driveway to her truck. The bag sat exactly where she had left it, perched awkwardly on the passenger seat. The sight of it made her heart race. Taking a deep breath, she reached for it, her fingers brushing against the damp fabric. The metallic smell hit her immediately, stronger now in the crisp morning air. Back inside the cabin, Lila set the bag on the kitchen table. Rusty barked again, his tiny body trembling as he inched closer to the table, then stopped abruptly. He growled, a low, guttural sound Lila hadn't expected from such a small animal. "Rusty, it's okay," she said, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. "It's just a bag." The puppy didn't move, his growl deepening. His eyes stayed fixed on the bag as if it were alive. Lila hesitated, her hands hovering over the zipper. She had no idea what she would find, but the thought of leaving it unopened felt worse than the alternative. She tugged the zipper slowly, the teeth grinding like nails on a chalkboard. Inside were the same items she had seen the night before: a cassette tape labeled "Play Me," a rusted locket, and a blood-stained scrap of fabric. But now, she noticed something she had missed: the faint impression of letters stitched into the lining of the bag. They were nearly illegible, faded from time and wear, but Lila traced them with her finger until the words became clear. E.R. Her breath caught. Evelyn Ross. The name sounded familiar, but she couldn't place it. Her mind raced as she picked up the locket, her thumb brushing over the photograph inside. The woman staring back at her had kind eyes framed by dark hair. Something about her face felt eerily familiar, like a ghost she couldn't name. "Who are you?" Lila whispered, her voice barely audible. Rusty barked sharply, snapping her out of her thoughts. His ears were pinned back, and his small frame quivered with tension. He was staring at the door now, his growl returning. Lila's heart pounded as she moved to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer outside. The driveway was empty. No strange trucks, no lurking figures. But the unease in her chest wouldn't subside. She turned back to the table, the locket still clutched in her hand. Her gaze fell to the tape. If it held any answers, she needed to know. Digging through the kitchen drawer, she unearthed an old cassette player, one she hadn't used in years but had never gotten around to throwing away. The tape slid in with a soft click. Lila hesitated, her finger hovering over the play button. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, trying to steady her nerves. With a deep breath, she pressed the button, and the room filled with the crackling sound of static. For a moment, there was nothing. Then a woman's voice broke through, soft at first, but growing more urgent with each word. "If you're hearing this, it means I didn't make it. My name is Evelyn Ross, and they're coming for me. They know what I found. You have to protect the dog. He's the key. Please, don't let him fall into their hands." The tape ended abruptly, the static resuming as Lila sat frozen. The words echoed in her mind. "Protect the dog. He's the key." She looked down at Rusty, now silent and staring up at her with those wide, knowing eyes. "What did she mean?" Lila whispered, more to herself than to the puppy. Rusty didn't respond, of course, but his gaze felt heavy, almost purposeful. Lila's hand tightened around the locket as a new thought gripped her. Whoever had left the bag last night might come back for it. She had to figure out what Evelyn had discovered, and fast. The words from the tape reverberated in Lila's mind. "Protect the dog. He's the key." She sat in the silence of her cabin, the static from the tape player filling the room like an unwelcome guest. Rusty, now lying at her feet, let out a low whine as though sensing her unease. The locket rested in her palm, the photograph within offering no answers, only questions. Who was Evelyn Ross, and why had she gone to such lengths to leave this cryptic message behind? And what did Rusty have to do with any of it? Lila felt the weight of it all pressing down on her chest. The duffel bag sat open on the table, its ominous contents like pieces of a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. But she had no choice. The unease in her heart told her that whatever Evelyn had feared was real, and it was closer than Lila wanted to admit. The morning sun streamed through the windows as Lila turned her attention back to the bag. The blood-stained fabric lay folded at the bottom, its edges stiff and crusted. She reached for it hesitantly, the metallic smell making her stomach churn. The fabric felt rough in her hands, and as she unfolded it, her breath caught in her throat. Embroidered along the corner were the initials ER, the same as the faded letters stitched inside the bag. Lila's mind raced. If Evelyn had left this bag, then she must have been in danger. But why? And from whom? Rusty barked suddenly, startling Lila out of her thoughts. His eyes were fixed on the window, his tiny body trembling. Lila followed his gaze, but saw nothing except the forest beyond. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their shadows dancing on the ground. "It's okay," she said, trying to reassure both herself and the puppy. "There's no one out there." Rusty didn't seem convinced. His growls softened but didn't cease entirely as Lila turned back to the bag. There was one more item she hadn't examined yet, the cassette tape's case. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands. The back was plain, except for a faint smudge of red. It looked like a fingerprint. Lila's pulse quickened. She grabbed her phone and snapped a photo of the print before setting the case back down. Every fiber of her being told her to call the police, but what could she even say? That she'd found an old tape, a bloody bag, and a frightened dog. They'd laugh her off, or worse, think she was crazy. The hours ticked by as Lila tried to distract herself with mundane tasks. She fed Rusty, cleaned the cabin, and even attempted to catch up on work emails. But the bag's presence loomed over her like a storm cloud. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She needed answers, and the only way to get them was to dig deeper. She grabbed her laptop and settled at the kitchen table, typing Evelyn Ross into the search bar. The results were sparse, an old obituary from 15 years ago, a few scattered mentions of her work as a journalist. Evelyn had been a reporter for the Bozeman Daily Chronicle, known for her investigative pieces on local corruption and environmental issues. One article in particular caught Lila's eye. "Timber scandal shakes local officials." She clicked on it, her heart racing as she scanned the text. The article detailed a corruption scheme involving illegal logging on protected land. Evelyn had been digging into the story when she suddenly disappeared. Her car was found abandoned near Gallatin National Forest, but no trace of her was ever discovered. Lila sat back, her mind spinning. Was this what Evelyn had been running from? And if so, why was the bag here now? She looked down at Rusty, who had curled up beside her chair, his scarred paw tucked under his chin. What did she mean? "You're the key," Lila murmured, stroking his fur. Rusty's eyes flicked open, and for a moment, she could have sworn there was something knowing in his gaze. By late afternoon, Lila decided to take Rusty outside for some fresh air. The forest surrounding her cabin was quiet, the kind of stillness that felt heavy, almost oppressive. She kept a close eye on Rusty as he sniffed around the yard, his tail wagging cautiously. Lila's thoughts drifted back to the bag and the photograph in the locket. The woman's face haunted her, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it felt familiar in a way she couldn't explain. She pulled the locket from her pocket, opening it once more. The corners of the photograph were worn, as though it had been handled countless times. The woman's expression was soft, almost maternal, and it made Lila's chest tighten. A sharp bark from Rusty snapped her out of her thoughts. She turned to see him standing at the edge of the yard, his body stiff, his ears pinned back. He barked again, his gaze locked on the trees. "Rusty, come here," Lila called, her voice laced with urgency, but the puppy didn't move. Instead, he let out a low growl, his fur bristling. Lila's eyes darted to the forest, her breath catching as a shadow flickered between the trees. Her heart pounded as she scooped up Rusty and backed toward the cabin. The shadow didn't reappear, but the feeling of being watched lingered, prickling the back of her neck. Once inside, Lila locked the door and drew the curtains. Rusty squirmed in her arms, his growl fading into a soft whine. She set him down and collapsed onto the couch, her hands trembling. "I don't know what's happening," she whispered, more to herself than to Rusty. "But I'm going to figure it out." She reached for the locket again, her thumb brushing over the photograph. Then she froze. Beneath the woman's picture, barely visible against the tarnished metal, was an engraving. Lila squinted, holding it closer to the light. It read, "For Rusty, my guardian, always." Lila's breath hitched. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they painted was one she wasn't sure she was ready to see. Who was Evelyn to this dog, and why did she trust him with such an important message? Rusty barked again, breaking her train of thought. This time, it wasn't a warning. It was urgent, almost commanding. He darted toward the kitchen, his claws skittering on the hardwood floor. Lila followed, her pulse quickening as she saw what had caught his attention. The duffel bag, which she had left zipped and sitting on the table, was now slightly open. And this time, there was a piece of paper sticking out of it, a piece that hadn't been there before. Lila stared at the slip of paper sticking out of the bag, her pulse quickening. She was certain it hadn't been there before. With trembling fingers, she pulled it out and unfolded it. The handwriting was uneven and hurried, the ink smudged in places. "They're watching you. Be careful. Trust no one." Her breath caught as the weight of the warning settled over her. Someone had been here. Someone who not only wanted her to find this message, but also knew enough about her to leave it where she would see it. A glance at Rusty, his fur still bristling, told her she wasn't imagining things. Whatever was happening, it was far from over. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. Lila barely slept, her thoughts circling back to the bag, the note, and the cryptic message on Evelyn's tape. Each piece of the puzzle seemed connected, but the picture they painted remained elusive. Rusty didn't leave her side, his watchful eyes scanning the room as though he expected something, or someone, to burst in. By morning, Lila knew she couldn't stay locked in her cabin forever. She needed supplies for Rusty, and more importantly, a clearer head. Gathering her things, she loaded the puppy into her truck and headed into town. Bozeman's downtown was a patchwork of small businesses and bustling streets, the kind of place where everyone seemed to know everyone else. Lila parked near the local pet store, hoping to slip in and out unnoticed. But as she stepped onto the sidewalk, she felt it, a prickling sensation at the back of her neck. Someone was watching her. She turned, her eyes scanning the street, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. People milled about, cars rolled by, and the chatter of life filled the air. Shaking her head, she tried to brush off the feeling and focused on her errands. Inside the pet store, she picked out food, treats, and a proper leash for Rusty. The cashier, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, smiled as she rang up the items. "Cute pup," she said, nodding toward Rusty, who sat at Lila's feet. "Where'd you find him?" "By the side of the road," Lila replied, keeping her tone light. "He was in pretty bad shape." The woman frowned, her hands pausing over the register. "You be careful out there. I heard some strange things have been happening in the woods lately." Lila's stomach tightened. "Strange how?" The woman leaned in slightly, her voice dropping. "Animals going missing, people too. Nothing confirmed, but you hear things." She straightened, giving Lila a meaningful look. "Just keep your eyes open." Lila nodded, suddenly eager to leave. She paid for her items and hurried back to her truck, her mind racing. If there was any truth to the cashier's warning, it only made Evelyn's message, and the danger surrounding Rusty, feel more urgent. As she drove through town, the prickling sensation returned. Her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, and this time she saw him. A man in a black truck, his face partially obscured by the glare of the sun. He was following her, Lila's grip on the wheel tightened. She took a sudden right turn, then another, weaving through side streets in an attempt to shake him. But every time she checked the mirror, the truck was still there, keeping its distance, but never letting her out of sight. Her mind raced. She could go to the police, but what would she say? That someone was following her because of a decades-old tape and a mysterious dog. They'd think she was paranoid, and maybe she was. But that didn't make the man's presence any less real. Rusty let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on the side mirror. Lila swallowed hard, her heart pounding as she pulled into the parking lot of her veterinary clinic. She grabbed Rusty and her bag of supplies, hurrying inside without looking back. The clinic was quiet, the usual bustle of patients and staff replaced by the hum of fluorescent lights. Lila ducked into the back office, setting Rusty on a blanket while she gathered her thoughts. She could feel the tension in the air, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The bell above the front door jingled, and Lila froze. Her mind immediately went to the man in the truck, but as she peered through the office window, her fear gave way to confusion. The man standing at the counter wasn't a stranger. It was Caleb York. Caleb had been a fixture in Bozeman for as long as Lila could remember. He was a quiet, solitary man, known more for the jagged scar that ran down his face than for his personality. People whispered about him, speculating about his past. War veteran, former cop, criminal, but no one seemed to know the truth, and Caleb didn't seem eager to share it. "What's he doing here?" Lila muttered to herself, watching as he spoke to the receptionist. He wasn't carrying any animals, and his demeanor wasn't that of someone seeking help for a pet. He was asking questions about her. Lila's breath hitched as she ducked out of sight. Why would Caleb be looking for her? And why now, after all these years of barely acknowledging each other's existence? Rusty let out a sharp bark, drawing Caleb's attention. His eyes flicked toward the office door, and for a moment, Lila thought he might come in. But instead, he turned and left, the bell jingling faintly as the door swung shut behind him. Lila waited until the sound of his truck faded before she let out a shaky breath. Caleb York was the last person she'd expected to see today, and the fact that he'd been asking about her made her skin crawl. Was he the one following her? And if so, why? Back at the cabin that evening, Lila replayed the day's events in her mind. The note in the bag, the man in the truck, Caleb's sudden interest in her. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite fit together. Rusty lay curled up beside her, his eyes half closed but his ears alert. He was waiting, just as she was, for whatever came next. Her thoughts drifted to Evelyn's tape and the words that had haunted her since she'd first heard them. Protect the dog. He's the key. If Evelyn had trusted Rusty with something so important, then Lila had to trust him too. As she locked the doors and double-checked the windows, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that her quiet life in Bozeman had just become the center of something much larger and much darker than she'd ever imagined. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the cabin as Lila paced near the window, her mind racing. Caleb York's sudden appearance at the clinic felt like a warning, a signal that the mystery surrounding Evelyn Ross and the duffel bag was far from over. Rusty sat by the door, his gaze fixed on the forest outside. He hadn't growled since they returned, but his tense posture spoke volumes. Lila turned away from the window, her chest tightening. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being drawn into something dangerous, something bigger than herself. The tape, the locket, and now Caleb. All signs pointed to the same conclusion. She had to go back to the forest. The next morning, the air was crisp and cool as Lila strapped a leash onto Rusty's collar. The puppy seemed more energized than he had in days, his tail wagging as they set off toward the wooded area where she had first found him. She carried a small backpack with water, a flashlight, and a notebook, just in case she found something worth documenting. The bag felt heavier than it should have, as though the weight of her uncertainty had somehow seeped into it. The forest loomed ahead, dense and quiet. Lila hesitated at the edge, the memories of that stormy night flashing in her mind. Rusty tugged at the leash, his small body vibrating with urgency. All right, Lila muttered, stepping onto the narrow trail. Show me what you've got, Rusty. The deeper they ventured into the woods, the more the air seemed to change. The sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves gave way to an eerie stillness, broken only by the crunch of Lila's boots on the forest floor. Rusty pulled harder on the leash, his nose close to the ground as though following an invisible trail. The path twisted and narrowed, the canopy above thickening until only slivers of sunlight broke through. Lila's heartbeat quickened. This part of the forest felt different, older, almost untouched. She hadn't been this far in before. Suddenly, Rusty stopped, his ears perking up. He barked sharply, the sound echoing through the trees. Lila tightened her grip on the leash. "What is it, boy?" Rusty barked again, then began digging furiously at a patch of dirt near the base of an ancient oak. Lila knelt beside him, brushing away leaves and debris. Her fingers hit something hard and cold. She pulled back, her breath catching as she uncovered the object. A rusted tin box, its surface scratched and dented. Carefully, she pried it open. Inside was a small stack of papers, yellowed with age and damp around the edges. Lila's hands trembled as she flipped through them. They appeared to be notes, detailed and precise, written in Evelyn's handwriting. The first page read, "They're taking the timber illegally, but it's more than that. People are disappearing, workers who speak out, locals who ask too many questions. They're silencing anyone who gets in their way. Rusty knows. He always knows." Lila's eyes darted to Rusty, who was sitting calmly beside her now, his head tilted as though he understood every word. The next page detailed locations, logging sites, meeting points, names scrawled hastily in the margins. One name stood out, Caleb York. Her stomach twisted. Why would Evelyn mention Caleb? Had he been involved in the illegal operations? Or had he been helping her? Lila couldn't shake the memory of Caleb's piercing gaze at the clinic, his questions about her. Was he an ally, or was he part of the danger Evelyn had warned about? As she tucked the papers into her backpack, a faint sound reached her ears, a branch snapping underfoot. Lila froze, her breath catching. Rusty growled low in his throat, his body rigid. Slowly, she turned, scanning the trees. Nothing moved, but the oppressive stillness had returned, heavier than before. "Let's go," she whispered, gripping Rusty's leash tightly. They made their way back to the trail, Lila's senses on high alert. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call, felt like a potential threat. Rusty stayed close, his growls subsiding but his eyes darting toward the shadows. By the time they emerged from the forest, Lila's nerves were frayed. She unlocked her truck with shaky hands, lifting Rusty inside before climbing into the driver's seat. The tin box sat on the passenger seat, its presence both a comfort and a burden. Back at the cabin, Lila spread Evelyn's notes across the kitchen table. She studied the names and locations, trying to make sense of the connections. One name, in particular, kept appearing: Thomas Grayson, a prominent local businessman who owned several logging companies in the area. The note suggested that Grayson had been orchestrating the illegal operations, silencing anyone who opposed him. Lila's stomach churned as she realized the extent of the danger she was in. Grayson wasn't just powerful, he was ruthless. And if Evelyn's notes were correct, he wouldn't hesitate to come after her if he discovered she had the evidence. Rusty let out a soft bark, pulling her attention back to the table. He pawed at one of the pages, his nose brushing against a specific line of text. Rusty was there that night. He saw everything. Lila's breath hitched. Evelyn hadn't been talking about the Rusty who sat beside her now. She had been talking about his predecessor, the dog who had accompanied her during her investigation. But if this Rusty was connected to the original, Did that mean he had been left behind as a clue? And if so, by whom? The weight of it all pressed down on Lila's chest. She ran a hand through her hair, her mind racing. She needed help, someone who knew more about Evelyn's disappearance, someone who could decipher the tangled web of names and locations in the notes. But who could she trust? Her thoughts drifted back to Caleb. His name in Evelyn's notes had unsettled her, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that he might hold the answers she needed. He had been asking about her, following her. Maybe he wasn't a threat. Maybe he was trying to warn her. Lila hesitated, her hand hovering over her phone. She didn't have Caleb's number, but she knew where to find him. If she went to him, it would be a gamble, one that could either bring her closer to the truth or put her in even greater danger. Rusty barked again, louder this time. Lila looked down at him, his wide eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name: fear, urgency, trust. Whatever she decided, she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't run from this anymore. Lila stared at the notes spread across her kitchen table, her mind racing. Evelyn's meticulous handwriting painted a picture of corruption and danger, but it was incomplete, like a puzzle missing its final piece. The connections were there: Thomas Grayson, Caleb York, and the original Rusty, but the full story remained just out of reach. Rusty whined softly at her feet, nudging her leg with his nose. His wide eyes seemed to urge her forward, as if he understood the weight of the discovery. Lila took a deep breath, steeling herself. If she wanted answers, she needed to dive deeper into Evelyn's life. And there was only one place to start: the library. The Bozeman Public Library was a quiet, unassuming building nestled in the heart of downtown. Lila hadn't been there in years, but as she stepped inside, the familiar scent of old books and polished wood filled her senses. Rusty padded along beside her, his tail wagging cautiously. The librarian, a petite woman with silver hair and a warm smile, glanced up from her desk. "Well, I'll be. Lila Prescott, is that you?" Lila blinked in surprise. "Mrs. Warren." The woman nodded, her smile widening. "You haven't been in here since high school. What brings you back?" Lila hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "I'm researching someone. Evelyn Ross. Do you remember her?" Mrs. Warren's expression sobered instantly. She gestured for Lila to follow her, leading her to a quiet corner of the library. "Evelyn Ross," she said, her voice low. "That name hasn't come up in a long time." "She was a journalist, right?" Lila asked, keeping her tone casual. "She disappeared about 15 years ago." Mrs. Warren nodded. She was one of the best, always digging into things people didn't want her to find. She ruffled a lot of feathers in her time. She paused, glancing at Rusty. "She had a dog too, looked just like this little one." Lila's pulse quickened. "What happened to her?" The librarian sighed, her fingers brushing over the edge of a nearby book. "She was investigating something big. Corruption in the timber industry, if I remember right. She told me she was onto something that could shake the whole town. Then one day she just vanished. Her car was found near the forest, but no sign of her or her dog." "Do you think someone hurt her?" Lila asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Warren's lips tightened. "I think Evelyn got too close to the truth, and when people like her do that, they make enemies." After thanking Mrs. Warren, Lila returned to the main floor, her mind swirling with questions. She searched the archives for Evelyn's old articles, poring over headlines and photographs. Evelyn had been fearless, exposing illegal logging operations and shining a light on the environmental devastation caused by powerful corporations. One article in particular caught Lila's eye. "Timber scandal deepens as whistleblowers go missing." The piece was filled with accusations against Thomas Grayson, painting him as the mastermind behind the illegal operations. The article's tone was bold, almost defiant, as though Evelyn had known she was stepping into dangerous territory. But there was something else. An accompanying photo of Evelyn standing in front of the very logging mill Lila had seen in the notes. Beside her was a dog, a larger version of Rusty, with the same coppery fur and piercing eyes. Rusty barked softly, breaking Lila's concentration. She looked down at him, her heart twisting. "Is that him?" she murmured. "Is that the Rusty she wrote about?" The puppy tilted his head as if to say, "You already know the answer." As the sun began to set, Lila gathered the articles and returned to her truck. She couldn't shake the feeling that Evelyn had left behind more than just words. She had left a trail, and somehow Rusty was the key to following it. Back at the cabin, Lila spread the articles alongside Evelyn's notes, connecting the dots as best she could. Thomas Grayson's name appeared repeatedly, always tied to missing workers, silenced whistleblowers, and shadowy deals. Caleb York's name, however, was less clear. In some instances, Evelyn referred to him as an observer, but in others, she seemed to imply he was an ally. "Who are you, Caleb?" Lila muttered, tracing his name with her finger. "Are you part of this, or are you trying to stop it?" Rusty let out a low growl, drawing Lila's attention. He was staring at the window again, his body tense. Lila's breath caught as a shadow flickered across the glass. Someone was outside. Grabbing a flashlight, Lila stepped onto the porch, her heart pounding. The forest was bathed in twilight, the fading light casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. She scanned the trees, her grip tightening on the flashlight. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling slightly. "I know you're watching me." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the usual sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, chirping crickets, seemed to have vanished. Lila's skin prickled with unease. Rusty barked sharply, his tail pointing straight as he darted toward the edge of the yard. Lila followed, her flashlight beam bouncing over the ground. She stopped short when she saw it, a piece of paper pinned to a tree with a rusted nail. Her hands shook as she pulled it free. The handwriting was unfamiliar, jagged and hurried, but the message was clear. They took her. "Don't let them take you too." Lila staggered back, her breath hitching. The note felt like a ghostly hand reaching out from the past, pulling her closer to Evelyn's fate. She looked down at Rusty, who stared at her with unflinching determination. Whatever Evelyn had been trying to uncover, Lila was now part of it, and there was no turning back. Inside, she locked the doors and drew the curtains, her mind racing. She replayed Mrs. Warren's words in her head. Evelyn got too close to the truth. Lila didn't know if she was ready to face that truth, but she knew she couldn't ignore it. The answers were out there, buried in the shadows of the past. And if she didn't find them, the danger Evelyn had faced would soon become her own. As Rusty curled up beside her, Lila opened her notebook and began sketching out a plan. The first step was clear. She needed to confront Caleb York. Whether he was an ally or an enemy, he held pieces of the puzzle she desperately needed. The words on the note replayed in Lila's mind like a haunting echo. They took her. Don't let them take you too. Each step deeper into Evelyn's past seemed to pull her closer to the same fate. But fear wasn't enough to stop her. If Evelyn had trusted Rusty with the truth, then Lila owed it to her to uncover it, no matter the risk. Her plan was simple. Find Caleb York and get answers. He was the thread tying Evelyn's notes, the forest, and Thomas Grayson together. Whether he was a friend or a foe, she needed to know. Rusty sat at her feet, his gaze fixed on her with an almost human intensity. "You're my little guardian, aren't you?" she murmured, stroking his head. The puppy wagged his tail, but his eyes remained serious, as though he understood the weight of the moment. Lila's truck rumbled down the narrow mountain road, the twilight casting long shadows across the landscape. She had spent the morning researching Caleb's last known address, a small cabin on the outskirts of town, isolated and surrounded by dense woods. It wasn't far from where she had found Rusty, a coincidence that now seemed too calculated to ignore. As she neared the turnoff to Caleb's property, A familiar prickle crept up the back of her neck. She glanced in the rearview mirror and felt her stomach drop. A black truck was following her, keeping its distance but never falling too far behind. Its headlights gleamed like eyes in the fading light. Her pulse quickened. She pressed down on the gas, the engine growling as her truck picked up speed. The black truck matched her pace, its presence a shadow she couldn't escape. The winding road offered little room for maneuvering, the edges flanked by steep drop-offs and thick trees. Lila's hands tightened on the wheel as she took a sharp turn, her tires skidding slightly on the gravel. Rusty barked from the passenger seat, his small body pressed against the door. "Hang on, buddy," Lila muttered, her heart racing. The black truck closed the gap, its grille looming large in her rearview mirror. The driver flashed his high beams, blinding her momentarily. Lila swore under her breath, fighting to keep the truck steady as adrenaline coursed through her veins. She spotted a narrow side road up ahead and made a split-second decision. Turning sharply, she veered onto the path, the trees closing in around her. The black truck followed, its tires kicking up dirt and debris as it pursued her into the woods. The side road was barely wide enough for her truck, the branches scraping against the windows like claws. Lila swerved to avoid a fallen log, her breath hitching as the black truck gained ground. It was closer now, its engine roaring like a predator closing in on its prey. Rusty let out a sharp bark, his eyes fixed on the rear window. Lila glanced in the mirror and saw the driver, a shadowy figure whose face was obscured by the glare of the headlights. Her mind raced. She needed to lose him, but the narrow path offered few options. Up ahead, she spotted a clearing, a potential escape route. Gritting her teeth, she pressed the gas pedal to the floor, her truck lurching forward with a burst of speed. The clearing opened up into a wide expanse of rocky terrain, bordered by a steep incline on one side and a dense thicket on the other. Lila swerved onto the rocks, her tires skidding as she fought for control. The black truck followed, its wheels crunching over the uneven ground. Lila's eyes darted to the incline. It was steep but navigable, and if she could make it to the top, she might be able to shake her pursuer. With no time to second guess, she turned sharply, the truck tilting precariously as it climbed the slope. The black truck hesitated for a moment before following, its headlights bouncing wildly with each jolt. Lila's truck struggled against the incline, the engine straining as the tires kicked up loose rocks. Rusty whimpered, his paws braced against the dashboard. "Almost there," Lila whispered, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. At the crest of the hill, the path narrowed once more, flanked by dense trees that blocked out the fading light. Lila took the turn too fast, her tires skidding on the loose dirt. The truck fishtailed, and for a terrifying moment, she thought she would lose control. But the tires caught traction, and she surged forward, the black truck still in pursuit. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her hands aching from gripping the wheel so tightly. The road curved again, and this time, Lila spotted her chance. Up ahead, a large tree had fallen across the path, its gnarled branches forming a natural barricade. She swerved sharply, veering off the road and into the underbrush. The black truck barreled forward, unable to stop in time. The sound of metal crunching against wood echoed through the forest as the black truck collided with the fallen tree. Lila didn't wait to see the damage. She pressed on, her truck bouncing over the uneven terrain until she was certain she had put enough distance between them. When she finally stopped, the silence was deafening. Her hands trembled as she killed the engine, her breath coming in short bursts. Rusty climbed into her lap, his small body warm against her chest. She held him close, her heart pounding as the adrenaline began to fade. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe she was safe. But the memory of the driver's shadowy figure lingered, a reminder that this wasn't over. Whoever was chasing her wouldn't stop, not until they got what they wanted. Lila's truck finally rolled into the driveway of Caleb York's cabin, just as the last light of day faded into darkness. The small, weathered structure sat at the edge of the forest, its windows glowing faintly from within. Lila hesitated, her nerves on edge. She had no idea what she would find inside. or if Caleb could be trusted. She took a deep breath, her fingers brushing over Rusty's fur for reassurance. "All right, let's see what you know, Caleb." Gathering her courage, she stepped out of the truck and approached the cabin, the weight of the day pressing heavily on her shoulders. Lila stood outside Caleb York's cabin, the night pressing in around her like a suffocating blanket. The soft glow of light spilling from the windows did little to ease the knot tightening in her chest. After the chase, her nerves were raw, her senses on high alert. Rusty sat at her feet, his ears perked and his small body tense. It was as if he too could feel the weight of what they were about to walk into. Taking a deep breath, Lila raised her hand and knocked. The sound echoed against the wooden frame, and for a moment, the only response was the faint rustling of leaves in the night breeze. Then, heavy footsteps approached the door. The door creaked open to reveal Caleb, his scar catching the light. His eyes were sharp, studying her with a mix of suspicion and something else. Something that made her hesitate. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and firm. Lila tightened her grip on Rusty's leash. "I didn't have a choice." Caleb stepped aside reluctantly, motioning her in. The interior of the cabin was sparse, with mismatched furniture and walls lined with shelves of books and maps. A wood stove crackled in the corner, casting flickering shadows across the room. Lila hesitated before stepping inside, her eyes darting around for any signs of danger. "What do you want?" Caleb asked, leaning against the edge of a table. "I need answers," Lila said, her voice steady despite the tension thrumming through her. She set her backpack down on the floor, unzipping it to reveal Evelyn's notes. "You were mentioned in her writing. Evelyn Ross. You knew her, didn't you?" Caleb's expression darkened at the name. He didn't deny it. "You have no idea what you're messing with." "Then tell me," Lila pressed, stepping closer. "What happened to Evelyn? Why did she leave all of this behind? And why is someone following me because of it?" Caleb's gaze flicked to Rusty, who was sitting quietly by Lila's side. He let out a long breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "It's not safe to talk here." The conversation continued in whispers, Caleb's voice low and clipped. He explained that he had been working undercover, trying to expose Thomas Grayson and his network of corruption. Evelyn had been close to uncovering everything, but she had disappeared before she could release her findings. Caleb admitted he had been too late to save her, but he had been trying to piece together her work ever since. "She left clues," Caleb said, nodding toward the notes spread across the table. "Bits and pieces of the truth, hidden in places only she knew I'd find. But someone else has been watching too. They've been cleaning up loose ends." Lila swallowed hard. "That black truck, it was following me. Do you think they know about me?" "They know," Caleb said grimly, "and they won't stop until they get what they're after." The weight of his words settled over Lila like a lead blanket. She looked down at Rusty, her hand instinctively resting on his head. She said Rusty was the key. What did she mean? Caleb hesitated, his jaw tightening. Evelyn trusted that dog more than anyone. He was with her the night she disappeared. If this Rusty is connected to him somehow, he might know something we don't. Lila's stomach twisted. The idea that Rusty might hold some crucial piece of information was both comforting and terrifying. She knelt beside him, her voice soft. "You're the key, huh? What do you know, little guy?" Rusty licked her hand, his tail wagging slightly. Whatever secrets he held, they were locked deep inside. As the night wore on, Caleb and Lila devised a plan. They would set a trap, using the duffel bag and Evelyn's notes as bait. Caleb suspected that whoever was after them would take the opportunity to make a move if they thought they could get their hands on Evelyn's evidence. "It's risky," Caleb admitted, his tone grave, "but it might be the only way to draw them out." Lila nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'm tired of running. Let's do it. The next evening, Lila stood on her porch, the duffel bag sitting conspicuously on the table. A hidden camera was positioned nearby, its lens trained on the bag. Caleb had insisted on watching from the cover of the trees, armed and ready in case things went south. Rusty sat at her feet, his ears twitching at every sound. The waiting was excruciating. Every rustle of leaves, every whisper of wind sent her nerves into overdrive. She kept her hands on the flashlight and the small radio Caleb had given her, her pulse pounding in her ears. Then she heard it, the soft crunch of footsteps approaching from the shadows. Lila's breath caught as a figure emerged from the tree line, their movements deliberate and cautious. The figure was tall, their face obscured by the hood of a jacket. They moved toward the bag, their gloved hands reaching for it. "Now," Caleb's voice crackled through the radio. Before the figure could grab the bag, Caleb stepped into view, his weapon raised. "Stop right there," he commanded, his voice like steel. The figure froze, their hands slowly rising in surrender. Lila's heart raced as she stepped forward, flashlight in hand. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure turned slightly, and the flashlight beam caught their face. A young man, his expression taut with fear. I was sent to get the bag," he stammered. "I don't know anything else, I swear." "Who sent you?" Caleb barked, his weapon steady. The man hesitated, his eyes darting between Caleb and Lila. "Thomas Grayson," he admitted finally. "He's cleaning up everything Evelyn left behind. He knows about you." Lila's blood ran cold. The man's words confirmed her worst fears. Grayson was not only aware of her, but was actively trying to silence her, just as he had silenced Evelyn. Caleb motioned for Lila to grab the bag while he kept the man covered. Rusty growled softly, his body tense as he watched the intruder. "What does Grayson want with the bag?" Lila demanded, her voice shaking. The man hesitated before answering. "It's not just the bag, it's everything she left behind, every scrap of evidence, every loose end. He wants it gone." Lila felt a surge of anger and fear. Evelyn had risked everything to expose the truth, and now Grayson was trying to erase her legacy. "You tell Grayson he's not going to win," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. The man nodded quickly, his eyes wide. Okay, just please don't hurt me." After disarming the man and ensuring he wouldn't pose a threat, Caleb escorted him back to his truck. Lila watched from the porch, her mind racing. Grayson knew about her, and he wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted. The stakes had never been higher, but neither had her determination. As Caleb returned, his expression grim, Lila looked down at Rusty. "We're in this now, aren't we, buddy?" she murmured. Rusty wagged his tail, his eyes full of trust. Lila's resolve solidified. Grayson might have power and resources, but she had something he didn't. Rusty, and the truth Evelyn had left behind. The man's words lingered in Lila's mind as she and Caleb prepared for their next move. Grayson wasn't just erasing evidence, he was erasing people. Evelyn's notes had pointed to the abandoned lumber mill as the key to her investigation, and if there were answers to be found, Lila knew they would be there. The risk was enormous, but the weight of Evelyn's unfinished work pressed down on her like a promise she couldn't break. Rusty, as if sensing her thoughts, stayed close by her side. His watchful gaze followed her every move, his small body vibrating with a quiet intensity. Lila reached down, brushing her fingers through his fur. "We'll find it," she whispered. "Whatever Evelyn was trying to show us, we'll find it." The drive to the mill was tense. Caleb sat in the passenger seat, his weapon resting against his leg. His jaw was set, his scar catching the dim glow of the dashboard lights. "The mill's been abandoned for years," he said, breaking the silence. "Grayson's people used it as a front for their operations, but after Evelyn disappeared, they shut it down." "Do you think there's anything left?" Lila asked, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "There has to be," Caleb replied. "Evelyn wouldn't have pointed us there if it was empty. She was always 3 steps ahead." Rusty let out a soft whine, his nose pressed to the window. Lila glanced at him, her chest tightening. "Whatever's there, we'll find it," she said, more to herself than to Caleb. The lumber mill loomed in the darkness, its skeletal remains silhouetted against the moonlit sky. The structure was massive, with broken windows and rusted metal beams that jutted out like ribs. Weeds and vines had claimed the perimeter, adding to its ghostly appearance. Lila parked the truck a safe distance away, cutting the engine. "This place gives me the creeps," she muttered, grabbing her flashlight. "It should," Caleb said, stepping out and scanning the area. "A lot of bad things happened here." Rusty hopped down from the truck, his ears perking up as he sniffed the air. His tail wagged once before he darted toward the mill, his leash tugging at Lila's hand. "Rusty, wait," she hissed, following him. "He knows something," Caleb said, trailing behind her. "Let him lead." The interior of the mill was even more foreboding than the outside. The floor creaked under their weight, and the air was thick with the scent of mold and decay. Rusty moved with purpose, his small frame weaving through the debris as though he knew exactly where to go. Lila's flashlight beam caught the remnants of machinery, their rusted forms frozen in time. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound amplified in the stillness. Rusty stopped suddenly, his nose pressed against the ground. He barked sharply, pawing at a trapdoor partially hidden beneath a pile of wooden planks. Caleb knelt down, brushing away the debris to reveal a rusted handle. "This must be it," he said, glancing at Lila. Her heart pounded as she crouched beside him. "Let's find out." The trapdoor groaned as Caleb pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. The air that wafted up was damp and stale, carrying a faint metallic tang. Lila swallowed hard, her flashlight trembling in her grip. "You don't have to go down there," Caleb said, his voice softening. Lila shook her head. "Yes, I do," Rusty barked once, his tail wagging as though to encourage her. Taking a deep breath, Lila descended the stairs, Caleb close behind. The basement was a stark contrast to the decrepit mill above. The walls were lined with filing cabinets and shelves crammed with boxes. A single bulb flickered weakly overhead, casting eerie shadows that danced with every movement. Lila approached one of the shelves, her fingers brushing over the dust-covered files. She pulled one out, her breath catching as she read the label. "Timberland Acquisitions, Confidential." "These are records," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Contracts, payments, proof of everything Evelyn was investigating." Caleb moved to another cabinet, his expression grim as he flipped through the files. "She wasn't just exposing illegal logging," he said. "She was tracking money laundering, bribery, even human trafficking. Grayson's operation goes deeper than we thought." Lila's stomach churned as the magnitude of Evelyn's work hit her. She turned to Rusty, who sat by her feet, his eyes locked on a specific corner of the room. Following his gaze, she noticed a metal locker partially obscured by a tarp. "What is it, boy?" she asked, stepping closer. The locker door creaked open, revealing a small safe. Its surface was scratched and dented, but the combination lock remained intact. Caleb knelt beside her, inspecting it. "Evelyn must have hidden this," he said. "It's too secure to be part of the mill." Rusty barked, his tail wagging furiously. Lila knelt beside the safe, her hands trembling. "How do we open it?" "Leave that to me," Caleb said, pulling a lock-picking tool from his pocket. "Give me a minute." As Caleb worked, Lila's nerves frayed. The quiet of the basement felt oppressive, and every creak from above set her on edge. Rusty stayed close, his body pressed against her leg as though to reassure her. Finally, with a soft click, the safe opened. Caleb stepped back, his eyes narrowing as Lila reached inside. She pulled out a stack of documents, a cassette tape, and a small journal bound in leather. "It's hers," Lila said, her voice thick with emotion. "This is Evelyn's." She flipped through the journal, her eyes scanning the entries. Evelyn's handwriting was hurried and uneven, her words laced with urgency. One entry stood out. If you're reading this, it means they haven't won yet. Keep Rusty safe. He'll lead you to the truth. Trust Caleb. He's one of the good ones. Lila looked up at Caleb, her chest tightening. She trusted you. Caleb's jaw tightened. I only wish I could have done more. Before Lila could respond, a noise from above froze them both. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoed through the mill. Rusty growled low, his body tense. They're here, Caleb said, his voice a sharp whisper. We need to move. Lila stuffed the documents into her backpack, her heart racing as the footsteps grew louder. Caleb motioned for her to follow, his weapon drawn as they made their way back up the stairs. The mill was no longer empty. Shadows moved between the machinery, their voices low and menacing. Caleb signaled for Lila to stay low as they crept toward the exit, Rusty padding silently beside them. Just as they reached the door, one of the figures turned, his flashlight sweeping across the room. Over here, he shouted, raising a weapon. Run! Caleb barked, shoving Lila toward the door. Gunfire erupted, the sharp cracks shattering the silence. Lila clutched Rusty to her chest as they sprinted into the night, her lungs burning with every step. Caleb covered their escape, his shots ringing out behind them. When they finally reached the truck, Lila threw open the door and climbed inside. Caleb jumped into the passenger seat, his face grim. Drive, he said, his voice laced with urgency. As the mill disappeared into the distance, Lila's hands tightened on the wheel. Evelyn's words echoed in her mind. They haven't won yet. For the first time, she believed it. The truck sped through the darkened forest, the shadows of trees whipping past as Lila's hands gripped the steering wheel. Rusty sat in her lap, his small body trembling, but his gaze steady. In the passenger seat, Caleb reloaded his weapon, his jaw tight and his eyes scanning the road ahead. Are they following us? Lila asked, her voice trembling as the adrenaline coursed through her veins. Not yet, Caleb replied, his tone grim. But they will. We need to get this evidence somewhere safe. The weight of Evelyn's journal in her backpack pressed against Lila's spine. They had what they needed, proof of Thomas Grayson's crimes, Evelyn's final notes, and the answers to a mystery that had lingered for 15 years. But getting it into the right hands was another battle entirely. By dawn, they reached a small motel on the outskirts of Bozeman. Caleb had chosen the location for its obscurity, far enough off the main roads to buy them some time. Lila parked the truck behind the building, out of sight, and they hurried into the room. Rusty immediately began sniffing around, his tail wagging cautiously as he explored the cramped space. Lila sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands still shaking. The events of the night felt surreal, like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Caleb pulled a burner phone from his bag and dialed a number. I've got the evidence, he said into the receiver. We'll need secure transport and backup. Grayson's men know we're onto them. Lila listened as Caleb outlined the situation, her mind racing. The thought of facing Grayson's wrath was terrifying, but she couldn't let fear win. Evelyn had risked everything to expose the truth, and now it was Lila's turn to finish what she started. Hours later, a convoy of black SUVs arrived at the motel. Men in suits stepped out, their movements precise and deliberate. Caleb greeted them, handing over the files and tapes. Lila watched from the doorway, Rusty by her side. One of the men, a tall figure with a commanding presence, approached her. Ms. Prescott, I'm Agent Carter with the FBI. We've been tracking Grayson's activities for years, but we never had enough to bring him down. This evidence changes everything. Lila nodded, her throat tight. Evelyn Ross, she gave her life for this. Make sure it counts. Agent Carter's expression softened. We will. The following days passed in a blur. Grayson was arrested in a high-profile raid, his operations dismantled and his network exposed. News outlets across the country covered the story, hailing Evelyn Ross as a posthumous hero. Her name was finally cleared, her work recognized for the bravery it represented. For Lila, the victory felt bittersweet. The danger had passed, but the scars it left behind were slow to heal. She spent her days poring over Evelyn's journal, piecing together the fragments of a life devoted to justice. Rusty stayed by her side, his presence a constant comfort. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Lila found herself at the edge of Gallatin National Forest. In her hands was the locket she had found in the duffel bag, the photograph of Evelyn tucked safely inside. Rusty trotted beside her, his tail wagging as he sniffed the familiar air. Lila knelt by a weathered headstone, her fingers brushing over the name etched into the stone, Evelyn Ross. She placed the locket on the grave, her chest tightening with emotion. "You did it, Evelyn," she whispered. "They didn't win." Rusty barked softly, as if in agreement. Lila smiled through her tears, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. Back at the cabin, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Lila resumed her work at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, finding solace in the quiet companionship of the animals she cared for. Rusty quickly became a fixture there, charming everyone he met with his curious nature and boundless energy. One day, as Lila watched him play with a group of children visiting the center, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Evelyn's legacy had brought justice, but it was Rusty who had brought healing. The scars of the past would never fully fade, but they no longer held her captive. Lila had found something more powerful than fear: hope. As the final light of the day fades, Lila sits on her porch, Rusty curled up by her side, and the quiet hum of the forest around her. This moment of peace reminds her of the journey they've endured, one filled with fear, courage, and an unwavering quest for truth. Evelyn's bravery and determination to expose injustice became the cornerstone of justice, proving that even the smallest acts of courage can ripple into monumental change. But what does this story teach us? It's more than just a tale of suspense and mystery. It's a reminder that silence in the face of wrongdoing is the greatest ally of corruption. It shows us that even when the odds feel insurmountable, taking a stand for what's right can inspire others and leave a lasting legacy. Rusty, too, teaches us something valuable about trust, loyalty, and the unspoken bond we share with animals. Despite his small size, his unwavering dedication helped Lila uncover the truth and ultimately brought healing, not just to her, but to Evelyn's memory as well. Share your views in the comments below. We can't wait to read them. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming and thought-provoking stories like this one. Every journey has a lesson, and together we can uncover them all. Thank you for watching, and until next time, remember, even the smallest act of kindness can create ripples that change lives. See you in the next story.